I don't normally speak on a theme that is so intertwined with psychological theory. I'm much more a philosopher, delve into the ideas on the history of thought, or do social analysis. But after having been on the radio for a few times in a give and take Q&A times across the air, this issue surfaced repeatedly. And so I have very plainly entitled this message, "Why Don't I Feel My Faith?" Or what if I can't feel my faith? When every commitment intellectually has been made, you expect that somehow there will be an engendering of the emotion that will conform to what it is you claim to believe in the mind or in the intellect. But many, many times, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, that feeling has either lapsed momentarily or somehow is not there with the same sturdiness that you would like to enjoy. And so that is the message that I want to bring to you. First, let me introduce it for you, and after introducing it, turn to 2 or 3 glimpses that we will need to take, bridging towards the end on the look that will provide for us the only legitimate answer, and tie it together at the end with a conclusion. How then do I apply all of this thought, particularly at a time where psychologists are delving deeper and deeper into this? 2 years ago, a prominent scholar, David Goleman, who has taught at Harvard and was formerly the senior editor of Psychology Today, he wrote a fascinating book called Emotional Intelligence. I haven't completely read it, but I have looked at it in a cursory glance and read 1 or 2 chapters that I think convey to us the heart of his thinking. He begins that book with a very powerful illustration as he talks about a couple by the name of Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey in 1993, comfortably and quietly traveling along in that Amtrak train that was then going to come upon the bridge that had been damaged, having been hit some time before, and all of a sudden that bridge caved in, and this train went plummeting into the waters that were going to gobble up many into an early grave. And this couple, Gary and Mary Jean Chauncey, were struggling to keep themselves above water. But their biggest challenge on hand was what to do with their 11-year-old Audrey, who had cerebral palsy and was wheelchair bound. And mother and dad worked furiously, only with desperate attempts to try and get her through either a window or a door into the hands of rescuers. And gloriously they succeeded, and Audrey was rescued by the hands of those who were in the waters, but she lost her mom and dad in the process in their last effort to give her the gift of life. And David Goleman, as he introduces that, in a staggering footnote to that episode, tries to explain, how do you interpret this capacity within the human mind? Not intellect. He is very definite about that. He's talking about the mind. And he says, of course, we need to understand what Darwin's theory has done for us here, the protection of the progeny at the hands of the stronger so that they will guard their own offspring. Why he had to go to a mindless atheistic evolutionary theory in order to explain such a heroic act, of course, I don't know, other than that it betrays some philosophical prejudices. But even he is not satisfied with that, because the mind transcends that kind of situation. And he says the only word to describe it is the word love. What is this simple epithet that comes into our lives so many times, either as a longing and as a need, or as receptors in an experience? And here mother and dad, dying themselves, giving their little 11-year-old girl that gift of love and that gift of life. Isn't it fascinating how in these moments we reach for some moral point of reference to explain what it is we have just witnessed? I wonder what Professor Goleman would have said if he'd been with us a few weeks ago when 2 or 3 of my colleagues and I were in a taxi in a city that I shall leave unnamed and a country also unnamed. but there was a thronging mass around us. I don't think it would be exaggerative to say if you had just stood out of that taxi, you could have probably seen thousands of people milling around, elbowing their way into every space available as they were crossing the street or trying to get in to the railway station to get their train for work. And all of a sudden we heard this pounding on the window. And we were about to lower the window and he stopped us. But here was a beggar woman, clutching a little baby in her arms. And the baby also with her hand reached out, and almost a planted expression of misery, as it were, on the child's face. And the woman and the child reaching out, asking for some money. We were about to do something when he shooed her away and then told us, don't give it to such people. These children are rented out here by people, by parents who have them, and then they are trained by these beggars to have this begging expression, and they make an awful lot of money exploiting tourists and people. Some of them indeed are pretty well-to-do. Now we sense the surge of emotion. On the one hand, looking at this pitiful sight, two outstretched hands, and feeling sorry for the woman who had to make a living that way. And all of a sudden the emotion surged in a different direction when we found out that she may not have been a victim herself as much as she could have been a victimizer. What I'm trying to point out to you very simply is this. Within the framework of human emotions, there are two inescapable components if you want to interpret them correctly. One is the component of morality. You cannot just describe heroism by some Darwinistic, naturalistic explanation. The mind cannot stop there. It reaches to something more laudable, something higher. But there is a second component, and that is the component of information. So that as legitimate as our emotions were, swirling with pity for what we thought was mother and child, all of a sudden the emotions were equally intense, but the information had now challenged that emotion in a different direction. Do you follow what I'm saying? Our feelings are real. We cannot escape them. But equally important is to take those feelings and put them within a moral and an informational framework. And this desire comes very, very early in life, I believe. I'm in the process of reading one of the most fascinating books I have ever read. It is very simply called Father and Son, written by one of the great literary scholars, Edmund Goss. It was sent to me by the preacher who was at the Duke Street Baptist Church in London. One time the pastorate was held by F.B. Meyer. And this particular friend of mine who's pastoring there now sent me this book after we teamed up together in the Orient. And he said, Ravi, you're going to have to read this. Just listening to your arguments as an apologist, this book will move you. The whole story is about young Edmund Goss, who basically grew up this young genius and was ultimately going to reject the faith of his father and his mother, to which he gave many rationalistic reasons. But listen to how he describes emotionally his response when he was only 7 and saw the death of his mother. It's a fascinating way to describe it by a genius. Now, and for the first time in my life, I no longer saw my mother's mild eyes smile on me with the earliest sunshine. Twice a day after breakfast and before I went to rest, I was brought to her bedside. But we were never again alone. Other people, sometimes strange people, were there. We had no cozy talk. Often she was too weak to do more than pat my hand. Her loud and almost constant cough terrified and harassed me. I felt as I stood awkwardly and shyly by her high bed that I had shrunken into a very small and insignificant figure, that she was now floating out of my reach, that all things, but I knew not what nor how, were coming to an end. She herself was not herself. Her head that used to be held so erect now rolled or sank upon the pillow. The sparkle was all extinguished from those dear eyes. I could not understand it. I meditated long upon it, all in my infantile darkness, in the garret or in the little slip of a cold room where my bed was now placed, and a great blind anger against I know not what awakened in my soul. Imagine A young 7-year-old boy who sees his mother slipping away is able to, with such a cryptic statement, express what he felt at that young age, a kind of a blind anger, but an anger that he did not know against what was now awakened within his soul. And so, my dear friend, when we look at this arena of emotions with which we all live, we find that it comes early in life, looking for a moral framework. Why would a 7-year-old boy be angry? Why wouldn't he just somehow find out that this is what life was all about? It was a given, especially as he was to surrender to the naturalistic theories later on in life. But that emotion of anger rose up. The emotion of love is describing the instance of a couple sparing the life of their child. And then we see the emotion of pathos suddenly turned to consternation, just sitting in a car trying to explain what was happening around us. And the fascinating thing, ladies and gentlemen, is that more and more modern humanity is trying to understand why we feel the way we do. Is this just glandular? Is this just conditioning? And there's a kind of a dark side, light side, noble side to it. I don't watch too much television, and I've heard that the commercials are the best part of it. But I do remember during one sporting game seeing a commercial with one of the beer companies. I don't know if you've seen that. It's this fellow who has been counseled earlier on or advised by his buddies to give up his local beer in order for some foreign brew. And he's sitting in the office of this counselor now who's trying to rescue him from this choice he had made earlier on. It's all supposed to be funny. Have you seen that? And this young fellow is sitting there in the couch, and this comedian is playing the role of the Freudian psychoanalyst, and he says to him, "Tell me what happened." And he said, well, they told me that I was going to find a better beer when I would just go for this import brand. And he says, "And how did you feel about it?" He says, "Well, I really felt very betrayed. I felt really betrayed." And he goes on to talk about the better taste that he wished he had in the local beer and wished he could make the change. And he was ready to make the change now. And how do you feel about it? The whole idea is focus on the feeling. They know how to make a jest at it. But now, because of the incursion of computers, it is no longer how do you feel about it in a joke. Now they're trying to wonder what is the difference between a computer, a thinking machine, and a human being. And they are not able to arrive at an answer without using the word feeling. Feeling is now no more humorous. It is bringing with it a whole context of soul and other concepts. Look at the Time magazine article recently, written by Professor Dale Gellertner, professor of computer science at Yale. Listen to the fascinating exposition he gives of how Deep Blue, the computer that was going to be matched up against Garry Kasparov, when he wrote it, the match hadn't taken place. As we all know, Kasparov was beaten. But listen to what he says. The idea that Deep Blue has a mind is absurd. How can an object that wants nothing, fears nothing, enjoys nothing, needs nothing, and cares about nothing have a mind? It can win at chess, but not because it wants to. It isn't happy when it wins or sad when it loses. What are Deep Blue's après-match plans if it beats Kasparov? Is it hoping to take Deep Pink out for a night out on the town? It doesn't care about chess or anything else. It plays the game for the same reason a calculator adds or a toaster toasts, because it is a machine designed for that purpose. No matter what feats they perform, inside there will always be a big zero. No computer can achieve artificial thought without achieving artificial emotion too. And then he goes on to say this, listen please, in the long run, I doubt if there is any kind of human behaviors computers can't fake, any kind of performance they can't put on. It is conceivable that one day computers will be better than humans in nearly everything. I can imagine that a person might someday have a computer as a best friend. But that will be sad, like having a dog for a best friend, but even sadder. But the gap between the human and the surrogate is permanent and will never be closed. Machines will continue to make life easier, healthier, richer, and more puzzling. And human beings will continue to care ultimately about the things they always have, about one another, and many of them about God. This dimension of the soul, this dimension of feeling. And yet, my dear friend, isn't it sad how often we seek answers on this very subject that I've raised for you right now? Why don't I feel God? If I know Him, I'm in church, I'm a committed Christian, I do all of these things, but sometimes God seems so distant and far. There is no felt presence of the infinite being Himself. I recall on one radio program, which is what prompted my mind to deal with this subject, somebody driving in a car had phoned in and asked me about this question, why she didn't feel the presence of God in her life. And of course, you've got 2-minute soundbite answers to give. And in fact, the program was coming to an end and I had to sign off. A few days later, another young woman miles away from here wrote to me. It was a sad letter. I looked at it again and again and did not know how to satisfactorily respond to her. She said, Mr. Zacharias, I listen to these radio programs regularly. She talked about our radio program and so on. She said, but I want to say something to you. As soon as I heard that question raised on the air, I was in my car too. I swerved over to the side of the road. I wanted an answer to that question because I struggle with it too. I was so disappointed. There was no answer forthcoming. And the tragedy I sensed with her was twofold. First, she desperately wanted an answer for it. And secondly, somewhere in her innocence or her naivete, she actually thought that something as profound as this could be satisfactorily answered in a 2-minute response on a radio program. Let me do my best to unfold an answer as plainly as I can, and if you can only wait till the last few moments to anchor it, because I think that's where the Bible wants us to get off on a subject so real as this. So let me take 3 looks to find an answer. Why don't I feel my faith? With all that I think I know about God, why don't I feel Him any closer than I do? I think the first thing to do is to take an outward look. To take a look at humanity as we encounter one another, what it is that we learn from each other. And we find out very quickly how important feelings are and that we all have them. At my table is a good friend, Nick Charles, who's a sports broadcaster with CNN. And we were talking just now about the sudden tragic situation of Konstantinov, who played hockey for the Red Wings. And having won the Stanley Cup, they were in a celebratory mood. And all of a sudden, within a matter of hours, they were involved in that terrible car accident. And he's lying in a hospital now, unconscious. That jubilation, that joy, that must have spread to a lot of people, especially his family, when he said this was the pinnacle moment of his hockey career, suddenly now possibly cut short or certainly daunted or threatened in some way. The reality of feelings, the surging of emotions, but more to the point, when we look around us and take this outward look, we get puzzled when we do not see emotional responses the way we think we ought to see them. When I was speaking in Hong Kong last year, a man in the audience stood up. It was a question and answer time. He was a Nietzschean. He was an atheist, kind of a nihilist, believed in the philosophy of despair, and was trying to defend Nietzschean philosophy. It is very difficult to do, and he proved it could not be done. I waved him over to the front afterwards. I said, I'd like to talk to you one-on-one, because Nietzsche, of course, that very, very prolific atheistic writer, however well-intentioned he may have been. So I said to him, if you really believe what you have just said to me in public, that morality was a figment of our imagination, that morality had no real point of reference, I said, do you really believe that? He said, I do. I said, let me ask you a question. If I were to take a newly born baby, a fresh glimpse of life there, take that little child with all of its exuberance and so on, and brought that baby onto this platform, and I took an axe or a sword and just chopped the head of that baby off, how would you feel? Would you think I have done something wrong? You'd be shocked at what he said to me, and a whole group of people standing around me. He said, well, let me put it this way. I will not like what you did, but I cannot say you would have done anything wrong. I said, there are three aspects of evil. There's the fact of evil, there is the face of evil, and there's the feeling of evil. The fact, there's an objective moral law we all somehow subscribe to. There's a face where we look to responsibility when there's a violation of it, and there's a feeling that a response we have. I said, even you with your nihilistic philosophy tried to do away with the fact, you've tried to do away with the face, but you could not do away with the feeling. You said, I will not like it. Why not? I don't know if you ever got a glimpse of the trial going on of Timothy McVeigh. I was sitting next to a psychiatrist in California about 2 weekends ago, and he made an interesting comment to me. This man is in the latter years of his practice, ready to retire. And I mentioned to him how I was sitting at the Atlanta airport ready to fly out to a city. And here we were in that crowded setting and watching the news on television, and the testimony was being given about the incident that McVeigh was involved in. And one of the factors that was mentioned was the man prosecuting him raised the question of one of the witnesses. Did you ever talk about the fact that innocent people could be killed, children could be killed, all kinds of innocent bystanders could be destroyed by a bomb so powerful? And the witness said, yes, sir, we did. But when we talked about it, his answer was, they have guilt by association. They are involved with this evil regime. And they may not be involved directly, but by associating with this kind of a government, they are evil themselves. All of these children, all of these so-called innocent people. It was fascinating to look around the people sitting and standing, watching that screen. Every one of them at the same time just shook their heads in disbelief. What were they all responding to? How is it possible to make such a feelingless comment about the death and the blowing up of innocent children? So when we look outward, we sense it. Psychiatrists deal with post-traumatic stress disorders. And this psychiatrist was telling me in California, I said, what is the most important thing you've learned in the last few years? He said, can I tell you something, Ravi? He said, and this man was not a professing believer in Christ. He was there for an evangelistic outreach. He said, in the last 8 years, all of my patients have been men. And the only thing I've been dealing with is how men for years have been taught to suppress their feelings and not be honest about their emotions, and some of the trauma they run into in their own lives because of this suppression. He said, I could write volumes on it. Just yesterday I was reading the People magazine issue of this young 18-year-old girl by the name of Melissa Drexler in Aberdeen, New Jersey, who is at her prom, enjoying this evening, excuses herself from her boyfriend, goes into the restroom, and basically delivers her 6-pound, 6-ounce baby. Except she takes that very baby, puts it into the garbage bag, puts it into the waste bin there, and walks out after tidying herself as if absolutely nothing had happened, and goes over to the disc jockey and asks him to play one of her favorite tunes. Till literally the trail of blood is followed by somebody and looked into the restroom, and this baby is found. People who were there at her arraignment said the most stunning thing was when she was confronted with it, completely expressionless on her face. Completely expressionless. It was as though it was a foreign object she'd swallowed that she had now spit out, and that was all there was to it. So you see the McVeigh sitting placidly. You see a young 18-year-old girl like this, and People magazine basically is now not even able to ask the question they used to. Now they're saying, how have they gone so very, very wrong? When you look around, you find out emotions Especially the legitimacy of emotions is expected by us. You don't expect a totally callous individual. And I think God has planted that into us. He's given us many a clue. You even take the physiological makeup of the human body. What happens if you were to suffer a severe wound on that arm? Several things will happen. Immediately you will notice a swelling develop, a redness develop. Why is that? Because all of a sudden a dilatation has taken place in the capillaries. The blood is just surging in there to expand the blood vessels with increased porosity so that the plasma can exude through those pores, and the white blood cells, or the phagocytes as they call them, literally meaning the devouring cells, can go through those pores, destroy the debris, destroy the bacteria, and the increased supply of oxygen with the blood can bring healing. But there's a sensitivity to that spot planted by God, basically to indicate to you and me, protect it. Protect it. You keep doing damage to that, and you will wound it in an even greater way. What then happens when emotions have lost their sensitivity? Look around and observe. I think God reminds us in His book how important the emotions are. And some of His greatest servants remind us that they are indicators of a spiritual reality. Listen to the words of David in Psalm 42. As the deer pants for the streams of water, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When can I go and meet with God? My tears have been my food day and night, while men say to me all day long, where is your God? These things I remember as I pour out my soul, how I used to go with the multitude, leading the procession to the house of God, with shouts of joy and thanksgiving among the festive throng. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God, for I will yet praise Him. My soul is downcast within me, therefore I will remember you from the land of Jordan. Deep calls to deep, which means just keep surging on and on. By day the Lord directs His love, at night His song is with me. I say to God, my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by the enemy? My bones suffer mortal agony as my foes taunt me, saying to me all day long, where is your God? The Bible tells us emotions are real, and some of His choicest servants experienced it, and when you look around, you see it is a legitimate cry. So we take an outward look and we see the legitimacy of emotions. Now we take an inward look and we now have to find out our distinctiveness. Why is it that we react individually the way you do? You look at someone else and say, he or she didn't react the same way. Why did I get so angry so easily? Why do I get so upset so easily? I remember my mother saying to me once when I was starting to get into philosophy and apologetics and all of that. My mother was a teacher, but she was a very simple woman. And one day she said to me, I don't know why you ask such questions. I don't even know why you think such things, she said. These things have never crossed my mind. We're different. We're different. I could hear some thought or read some line in a book and I'd pace the floor for about 15 minutes saying, how does one wrestle with this? How does one deal with this? Let me ask you a few questions, for example, because we know how important it is to understand ourselves. Question number one, what experiences or struggle did you bring into your relationship with God? Was there a childhood? Was there an upbringing that struggled with some ideas? Let me assure you, at time it'll surface, at time it'll come. We are indebted to psychological theory for understanding this. Even though I have entered my 5th decade of life, probably at this stage more than any other, sad experiences or humiliating experiences with somebody who you loved dearly have become suddenly louder within my emotional being. I could have been 12 or 13 and something could have been said to me that suddenly comes back in your mind and you swallow hard and say, did he really mean that when he said it? Did he really think I'd come to nothing? An Olympic athlete whom I shall leave unnamed came to visit me here in Atlanta a couple of years ago. I won't name him, but I'll try my best and to guard his identity, even though if he were here, he would share it with you. He sat across a table at a hotel where we were having lunch, this muscle-bound individual. He was going to win a medal, he was sure. He said, from the time I was 12, I was determined I was going to make the Olympics one day. He said, I never ran up one step at a time from the time I was 12. I climbed 2 or 3. I was always in a conditioning mode. He said, then I watched the event I wanted to do, and as I got into my teens, I bought myself a video camera, and I filmed the world champion in that event, and then I had somebody film me. We were just a few seconds apart, and I went up into my room and cut it into individual slides along the whole event and wanted to see where I was losing those seconds to him. How could I make up? Was it at the 50-meter mark? Was it at the 60-meter mark? I was going to meet this man and beat him. And I worked away slide by slide by slide till I was ready for the championship. And the Olympic Games were upon us, and the world was watching, and I was tipped to win the Olympic gold medal then. But even as I was standing right at the top, about for the gun to sound, he said, Ravi, you'd never believe, and nobody will understand this. As I was literally seconds away, waiting from the gunshot, ready to take off for this moment for which I'd lived for so long, a thought flashed into my mind. I wonder if my father is watching. And he said, because it was my dad who looked at me in my early teens and said I was a good for nothing and nothing was ever going to come out of my life. He said, here I was ready for the greatest moment where something was going to come of my life. And what do you think comes into my mind? Is this going to be nothing too? I wonder if my dad's watching. You bring that into an experience. I know whereof I speak. And you have to ask yourself the question, when the feelings seem distant, is that part of the struggle? Have you read the biography of William Cowper, the great poet and songwriter who worked with John Newton in Olney in England? We visited John Newton's church and seen the words of his great hymn, Amazing Grace, and many of William Cowper's hymns etched on glass there too. Cowper was the music director for John Newton. And the reason William Cowper went to work with John Newton is because Cowper was a very morbid personality, constantly given to depression. He is the one who wrote, God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. His purposes will ripen fast, unfolding every hour. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. Blind unbelief is sure to err and scan his works in vain. God is his own interpreter, and he will make it plain. William Cowper is also the one who wrote, there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath the flood lose all their guilty stains. The dying thief rejoiced to see that fountain in his day, and so may I, though vile as he, wash all my sins away. But it is the same William Cowper towards the end of his life who wrote, where is the joy that once I knew when first I saw the Lord? Where is the soul's refreshing view of Jesus and his word? What peaceful hours I once enjoyed, how sweet their memory still, but they have left an aching void this world can never fill. He brought that personality through his life through pendular swings. There's a second question. What indisciplines did we bring into our Christian experience? What indisciplines? May I say that here the answers begin to unfold. Having taught at a graduate level for some years and working closely in the academic world for many years now, and having observed my own life, I have noticed that those who are separating in lines of accomplishment are often not those in capability, but those in discipline. Those who have known to apply themselves, buy up the time, redeem the time, take up the hours, and make them to be constructive. At Stanford University, 30-some years ago, a test was done with 4-year-olds. They were all given a marshmallow in their hands, and they were told that in a few minutes the teacher would come back, and those who had not eaten that marshmallow and waited would get a second one. But those who had eaten it would not get another one. And they had a camera in there and filmed these 4-year-olds. Some young fellows hitting their forehead, just clenching their teeth and gritting and looking away, pushing it. I think I would have been one of those at that time. Put it in the pocket. Don't even look at it or you're going to consume it. And there was some just, this is the rule. I want to. I'm going to wait. 30 years later, they have studied the same group of people. There is an incredible line of difference between those who gobbled it up and those who waited. Those who were willing to live with delayed gratification across the years from their adolescence all the way up to now, even to the point of a remarkable difference in their SAT scores. Enormous difference. And the Stanford psychologist said, you watch the child who is not able to resist early, and you better train that child soon, or this boy or girl will go through all of life, whatever they see, they want, and they're going to get it. Forget the cost. What disciplines did we bring in?